Can you truly escape fear when it doesn't lurk in dark alleys or abandoned buildings, but waits quietly behind familiar doors, wearing the faces you once trusted most? And what happens when the word home no longer feels like safety, but instead becomes a place where every conversation feels like a test, every silence feels threatening, and every smile feels rehearsed? Because from the outside, family looks like warmth and protection, yet for many survivors the real terror begins not with strangers but with parents, siblings, and relatives who slowly dismantle a person's sense of reality. And this is where our story begins, right here on True Terror Files Official, where we uncover the darkest truths hidden behind ordinary lives. So before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe and stay with us, because these are not stories told for shock. They are told because silence allows horror to survive. And tonight we explore real psychological terror born inside families, where manipulation replaces love, control replaces care, and trust is weaponized. Where victims are not beaten but broken slowly through words, denial, emotional withdrawal, and gaslighting so subtle it takes years to recognize. And imagine a child growing up believing they are always wrong, always too sensitive, always the problem, because every emotion they express is dismissed, every memory questioned, every fear minimized. And over time, the mirror they use to understand themselves becomes shattered, reflecting only what others want them to see, leaving one terrifying question echoing in the background of every moment. What happens when the people sworn to protect you become the architects of your psychological torment? In one anonymized account shared by a survivor, the abuse never arrived as shouting or visible cruelty, but as quiet manipulation disguised as concern, where a parent would deny past conversations, rewrite events, and subtly convince the child that their memories were unreliable, creating a daily atmosphere of confusion where reality itself felt unstable. And as years passed, the victim learned to doubt every thought they had, believing that disagreement meant disloyalty, and questioning authority meant emotional punishment. While in another case, a sibling dynamic turned into a battlefield of control, where jealousy manifested not as rivalry, but as systematic humiliation. Rumors whispered within the family, secrets exposed at strategic moments, and emotional isolation enforced by convincing others that the victim was unstable or dramatic. And perhaps most disturbing are the cases involving extended family members, uncles, aunts, or grandparents who reinforce the abuse through silence or complicity, creating an environment where cruelty was normalized and resistance was labeled betrayal. And what makes these stories especially chilling is that the victims often continued to attend family gatherings, smile for photographs, and maintain appearances while internally living in constant fear, because leaving meant losing everything they were taught to value, and staying meant surrendering their identity, demonstrating how psychological horror thrives, not through violence but through loyalty twisted into chains. Psychological abuse leaves no visible bruises, yet its damage can echo for decades, embedding itself into the nervous system and shaping how survivors perceive safety, love, and self-worth. And many victims describe living with constant hypervigilance, always anticipating criticism, abandonment, or emotional punishment, even long after leaving the abusive environment, while anxiety becomes a permanent companion and depression settles in quietly, convincing them they are inherently flawed. And experts explain that prolonged emotional manipulation can rewire the brain's stress response, making trust feel dangerous and calm feel unfamiliar, which is why survivors often struggle to form healthy relationships, fearing intimacy while craving connection. And perhaps the cruelest aspect of these invisible wounds is how easily they are dismissed by others. Because without physical evidence, the pain is questioned, minimized, or invalidated, reinforcing the same gaslighting patterns that caused the trauma in the first place, leaving survivors trapped in a cycle where even healing feels like something they must justify, proving once again that psychological horror does not need monsters, it only needs denial. Recognizing familial psychological abuse is often the hardest step, because society teaches us that family loyalty is sacred, that parents always mean well, and that speaking out is an act of ingratitude, which is why many victims remain silent for years, unsure whether what they experienced even qualifies as abuse, especially in cultures where emotional control is normalized and boundaries are dismissed as disrespect. But breaking that silence begins with understanding patterns rather than isolated incidents, noticing repeated invalidation, chronic guilt, fear of expressing emotions, and the constant feeling of walking on eggshells. And while confronting abusers directly is not always safe or effective, survivors can begin reclaiming control by seeking external validation, documenting experiences, setting emotional boundaries, and reaching out to mental health professionals or trusted individuals who can offer perspective without judgment. Because naming the abuse does not destroy families. It reveals truths that were already harming those within them. And silence, no matter how polite, only allows psychological terror to continue its quiet work. Healing after familial psychological horror is not about forgetting the past or forgiving those who caused harm, but about reclaiming the right to define your own reality. And many survivors who once believed they were broken eventually discover that their sensitivity was not weakness, their memories were not flawed, and their emotions were valid all along. And through therapy, self-education, and supportive communities, they slowly rebuild trust, not just in others but in themselves, learning that chosen family can be safer than biological ties, and that boundaries are not acts of cruelty but acts of survival. And while the scars may never fully disappear, they can transform into reminders of resilience rather than pain. And if you're watching this and recognizing parts of your own story, know that you are not alone. Your experience matters, and healing is possible even when betrayal comes from those closest to you. Because the most powerful ending to psychological horror is not revenge but freedom. And here at True Terror Files Official, we share these stories not to frighten but to illuminate, empower, and remind you that your voice deserves to be heard. So if this story resonated with you, subscribe, stay with us, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is believe yourself.